and welcome back. Today we're going to show you how to make a toy car like this one. Eventually you'll be able to customize it as much as you want, but for now we'll go over the basics. Here are the pieces you'll need. A 2x4 of pine, approximately a foot long, and a dowel rod, a 1/4 inch diameter. This will be for the axles of the car. And then a package of little toy car wheels that look kind of like this. We'll need spray adhesive and wood glue. And then you'll want some scissors and the printed pattern for the toy car, and you'll actually want a couple copies of that because we'll be sticking it directly onto the wood. And you'll need sandpaper to make sure it's all nice and smooth at the end. That looks kind of like this. And then an assortment of acrylic paints in whatever colors you want, paintbrush, and polyurethane, which is kind of a clear varnish that we use to seal the finished project. First, we need to pick out our wood. Grandpa, what are some things we should look for?
We should look for a plain 2x4 of pine, nice straight grains that you can see on the side, and on the end we want the grain to come across rather than this way.
So short way, not long way.
That's correct.
All right. So the first thing we need to do with this?
First thing we need to do is to trim off these 2x4s. Come with a rounded corner. So we'll need to cut off a small strip so that we have a nice flat bottom on the car.
And we do that at the table saw.
And we do that at the table saw.
All right, let's take it over.
Okay, now we've moved to the table saw, and there are a few basic things that we need to consider when you use a table saw. First of all, you need to keep your guards in place when it's running. I've lifted this so we could see the blade. Setting up, you need to raise the blade height such that it will cut through 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch through the material. You need to check to make sure that the blade is set properly. With the square, you can tell that it's set perpendicular to the table. This checks out well. So then the next step is to set the fence so that you're cutting at the right width. And our objective is to cut enough off so that we have a square corner here rather than the rounded corner which comes on normal 2x4s. So I've set this to the width. So the next step is to actually cut it off. In doing that, we're going to put our face masks on, we're going to turn the dust collection system on, and then do the cuts. So, we've taken the radius off so we have a nice square corner at the bottom.
Now we have a nice bottom edge for the car, and we can move on to the rough shaping process. You'll need your car patterns printed and cut out for this, like these couple. If you're using a hand saw, you'll want a pattern to glue onto each side of the wood so you can make sure you're cutting through square. If you're scroll sawing it, you can get away with just one pattern. I'm going to use the pattern from the book, but once you get some practice, you could draw whatever sort of pattern you wanted.
Next, we will glue the pattern to the wood. We'll use a spray type adhesive, so I'll spray that on. And we can stick one pattern on this side. Careful to line up the bottom edge as well as the one end.
Is that straight enough?
That looks good.
Okay.
Okay, now we'll turn it over, and this is the front. So we want to make sure we glue this other one on the same, making sure that the pattern is in the same direction as the first one.
Needs to go upside down.
With the front towards. Okay, now we have the patterns glued on both sides with the front here and the front here so that we could saw through following the lines on both sides. Next we'll demonstrate using the coping saw, which is a saw like this, which has a fine narrow blade so that it can turn corners. And I'll just demonstrate it for a short time. To do that, I'll put it in the vise. If you do not have a vise, you can clamp it to a sawhorse or the edge of a workbench or table. But we have to be careful to keep it level or square across. That's why we put a pattern on each side. Now we'll cut that piece out so it'll be easier to work with. I'll do that just like that. Next we'll demonstrate the use of a scroll saw to do the remainder. We want to finish cutting out the cars using the scroll saw. We've shown you how to use the coping saw. And now before we start, we need to do several things just to talk about the scroll saw. There are different blades for different materials, different thicknesses of wood, different types of wood. So we've selected one here that is good for cutting this thickness as well as the pine. We need to first tension the blade. You see it's loose now. And we want to tension it so that it's tight and will actually play a tune like almost like a banjo. Okay, then the next thing is to set the foot. And I've already adjusted it so that it allows you to push the material through, but yet it holds it quite snug.
So otherwise the wood will bounce all over the place?
Right, so you set it with just a little tension in it and lock it in and then check. That feels about right. You still need to be able to move the wood through the blade, but yet you don't want it bouncing. Okay, then for speed, we'll set the speed to about a third of the maximum that it will go. For real thin wood, you'd want to set it for the maximum. For the thicker, you'd want to go a little slower. Now we have our car roughed out in shape. Okay, our next step in building our car is to drill the holes for the axle. The axle itself is 1/4 inch, so we need to be larger than that. So we need to drill a hole at least 9/32. So what I wanted to do is transfer the location of the hole on our pattern over to the other side since our pattern was in. So using a square, I square from the side that's on the pattern, square directly across up this side, and then I measure up the same distance as this side. I did that on for both axles.
So you've got little guiding lines.
So by drilling by hand, it's best to drill halfway through this side, turn it over, drill halfway through the other side. So I'll do that. I'm going to use a smaller bit than our 9/32 because it's easier to control. And then our 9/32 will just follow the hole that we make. So I'll drill about halfway through with this one. I'll check to make sure I'm setting up square as I can, and then I'll drill a hole. That's approximately halfway through. Now we'll drill the other one, and we'll do the same thing. Now we'll flip it over and finish going on through with our hole.
And hopefully they'll meet in the middle.
Somewhere. That one went through.
It did. Should I hold the other end?
I think we'll be all right. Okay, so we have the smaller hole through. Now we'll change bits and finish with our bigger one. Okay, next, before we can install the wheels on the car, we need to cut the axles to the proper length. We need to calculate the length. We have two wheels, which are 7/16 thick. So two of those would add up to 7/8 of an inch. The car body is 1 1/2 inch thick. So if we add 1 1/2 and 7/8, we get 2 3/8. And we want 1/16 clearance, so that's 2 7/16. So I will mark the length on our dowel. 2 7/16. And we'll cut it. When you're cutting, it needs to be sure to get it as square as possible. And I need to cut one more. Now I should have two axles the same length, which we do.
Now we're ready to sand our car. There are a few different kinds of sandpaper, so I'll show you a little bit about what you need to know. First, we're going to start with a 60 grit sandpaper. It's coarser and will let us take bigger bits out of the wood. So we'll use that to round these edges, the sharp edges on the car. And once we get that done, we'll graduate to a 120 grit, which is a little bit finer and will let us start smoothing the body of the car down. Once we finish with that, we'll move to a 180 grit for the final polish. Something you might want to do is to wrap your sandpaper around a block of wood that you might happen to have handy. This just helps it be a little easier on your fingers. Remember to go with the grain when you're sanding, although when you're doing these edges you can cheat a little bit. See, we've smoothed that down a little bit, so we'll move on to this next section. This will take a while, so take your time, have fun, and don't forget to do the edges of the axles once you've finished with the car. Once it's all sanded, you can start fancying it up as much as you want. I'll paint mine, but if you wanted, you could keep on sanding to make the hood have a little curve to it, or make the trunk slope a little bit, kind of like a real car, whatever you want to do. When you're ready to paint, you might want to find something that will let you hang up the different pieces while you're painting, kind of like this. I've got the wheels on some little pieces of wire, and that'll let me be able to paint it without having to hang on to it and getting paint all over my fingers. Then I'll just hang it up here and let it dry. I'm using acrylic paint for this, and I think maybe I'll make this car blue. You can go ahead and paint your car, and then once it's painted, let it dry. And if you want, you can add a finishing coat of polyurethane to seal it. When it's ready, come on back and we'll show you how to do the final assembly.
We would like to show you how to assemble the axle and the wheels. We'll put a small amount of glue on the end of the axle, just so that it distributes itself into the wheel. We want to be careful not to get a lot of glue on the axle itself. Now we'll drive this in, flush like that, and then we'll wipe the glue off of there. We'll do that with both wheels, two wheels and the two axles. Okay, now we're ready to insert them through the car, and then we'll put a small amount of glue on the end of the axle, and we will then tap this wheel in flush with the end of the axle. There. Still has clearance with our 1/16 of extra length. We'll do the same with the rear axle. There we have the finished car with the wheels and axles assembled.
Thanks for crafting with us. We'll see you next time.